Hi, Mark.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I am doing well. Honored to be with you, sir.
Well, it's an honor to have you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You're Mark Leon Goldberg. And first of all, you publish a Substack called Global Dispatches. And you're host of not one, but two podcasts. Well, you're co-host of one called To Save Us from Hell, which you co-host with kind of a scholar of the UN. I assume that's a phrase that somebody once said about the UN. It's here to save us from hell.
Yeah, well, so Dag Hammarskjöld, the second UN Secretary General, once famously said that the United Nations was not created to save us. Let me say that again.
From heaven, of course, because they wouldn't do that.
To deliver us to heaven, but to save us from hell. And yeah, that's where we got the name of that podcast. It's a new one. We started it in June. It publishes every other week. My co-host is Anjali Dayal, who is a scholar of the United Nations at Fordham University, and just a great co-host with whom I have a rapport. And Global Dispatches is the longest running independent international affairs podcast. I started it, believe it or not, in 2012, have been publishing 2 episodes a week, every week since then. Back then, I had to tell people what a podcast was. And then Serial came along in 2017 and podcasts went mainstream. And
yet that wasn't, in a certain sense, your first podcast.
No, indeed, Bob.
You had a regular show on a platform that, let me think, oh, yes, that was me. I started that platform along with Mickey Kaus, Greg Dinkel, Bloggingheads TV. You had a regular weekly show that was called UN Plaza. Is that right?
UN Plaza, yeah. I mean, honestly, kind of similar to what I'm doing with To Save Us from Hell now. So you can say you're the inspiration. I don't know if you get any like IP rights, but
I'm happy to collect royalties. If you'll just credit me with launching your broadcast career from now on, that's enough. Thanks.
Really. I mean, I was like, I turned 44 2 days ago. I was like 25 when I did the UN Plaza on Bloggingheads with you. That was fun.
Well, with Matthew Lee, the who was at that point covering the UN.
Yeah.
And was it was a great chemistry for a while, and then he went on
for a while. It ran its course, but I would say though that Bloggingheads back, it really. So most of what I do these days is interview people. This is going to be different for me because I'll be speaking much more than I typically do on my normal show. It's not like the Mark Goldberg Views on Foreign Policy show. It's me interviewing people. But if you'll remember, the UN Plaza kind of morphed into an interview show, which kind of got lit the spark for me that I really do love interviewing people. That's where I think I have a unique skill set, and that is what inspired Global Dispatches.
And that is why you credit me wherever you go and whenever anyone asks you who you credit.
Absolutely.
You credit me. So we're going to talk about the Trump administration and the United Nations, maybe global governance a little more broadly. But, I think Trump's not a big fan of the UN. And I think he represents really a constituency that for some time hasn't been, there's a strain in American politics, as you know, that goes back through kind of Pat Buchanan and a kind of a somewhat nationalist strain of conservatives who have not been huge fans of, well, they've been what they consider to be fierce defenders of American sovereignty, which means very limited commitments to things like international treaties. Including the treaty on which the UN rests. So
I would almost quibble with your description of Trump's approach to the United Nations. So, we have a body of evidence, right, from the first administration. And, what the first administration taught us is that Trump was not intrinsically hostile to the United Nations. By most accounts, he rather liked being feted there every September at the UN General Assembly. In the first part of his administration, while Nikki Haley was still the UN ambassador, the administration did look towards the UN on some key issues, like on working at the Security Council to ramp up pressure on Kim Jong-un. And while some parts of the UN came under attack, they came under attack as they would under any normal Republican. So like the US pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council. They suspended funding to the UN Population Fund. UNRWA, the Palestinian Humanitarian Relief and Works Agency, came under attack. But other entities like the World Food Program saw an increase in funding. So there wasn't this like knee-jerk hostility towards the UN that I think some people assumed Trump might bring. It was a little more nuanced than that. Now, I think things started to change a bit at the very end during COVID. And during COVID, Trump very transparently sought to blame the World Health Organization for his own incompetent handling of the COVID crisis here. And, in the context of like an election season, again, shifted the blame to the WHO and sought to withdraw from the WHO. That's where you saw things start to become like a little more sharply hostile. But in general, he did not have this like intrinsically hostile approach to the UN. And I'm sure in a bit we'll get into Elise Stefanik in the UN and what we learned from her confirmation hearing. But I do want to like set that kind of context.
Okay, yeah. I mean, maybe I was over extrapolating from the WHO thing. Although, look, he has said he is an enemy of global. He said he hates global governance. He has said as much. Global governance. Now, he says a lot of things, and you should pay more attention to what he actually does. And I'll take your point that he has not tried to completely disengage the U.S. from the UN. Maybe I was.
Not yet. It could happen.
Not yet, but he
has already
withdrawn.
But I'm just saying what we learned from the first administration, and we're like 9 days into the second administration. We can talk about where things might be headed, but just to set that like baseline context.
The withdrawal from the WHO has happened. That's done, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like a process to withdraw, but for all intents and purposes, the U.S. is done. And what's interesting to me about that is really, two things. One, as I mentioned earlier, the decision to withdraw the first time around was done in like the context of COVID and a political campaign. So one of the key indicators to me going into this administration of whether or not of how Trump might approach the UN is what would happen with the WHO. Was his decision to withdraw from the WHO simply a product of the political context of the time, or does it suggest like a deeper seated grudge or hostility towards the UN? And it turns out it was an on day one executive order. So yeah, it suggests the latter.
Yeah. When you talk about the Republican Party in the UN, it kind of makes me think that actually the party in general has, over the last few decades, kind of picked up on what was once an attitude to the UN that was more confined to the nationalist part of it. You know what I mean? I mean, let me put it this way. George H.W. Bush, would you not say, the first President Bush, was a bigger fan and a more effective user of the UN than George W. Bush?
George H.W. Bush was, in fact, the former ambassador to the United Nations.
Ambassador of the UN, correct.
And he was probably like the friendliest, or if not friendliest, maybe not the term. He is the president that I think in like almost like realist terms understood the value and utility of the United Nations to advance American interests, and also had like a very friendly relationship with the UN Secretary General at the time, Javier Perez de Cuellar. It's funny, like a while ago, I came across some like FOIA documents that were communications between George H.W. Bush and Javier Perez de Cuellar during the Saddam Hussein, like preceding the first Gulf War. And there was this moment, if you'll remember, where like Saddam had a bunch of like hostages that he was using as shields to prevent the bombing of Baghdad.
Were they inspectors or what? Who
no,
were
they were like civilians. They were just like civilian foreigners in Baghdad. Famously, like a little British kid who Saddam Hussein like gave a glass of milk on camera so he could
yeah. Very nice of you. How about
and
you just
so
let him go? Yeah.
Javier Perez de Cuellar was like instrumental in like getting those like civilians out preceding the first Gulf War. And but there was like a very friendly, notes exchanged, cables, I suppose, between
Yeah.
them.
Well, the other thing is, Bush, the first Bush, actually went to the Security Council and got authorization for that war, for the Persian
Yeah,
Gulf War. That was a legal war under international law, whereas the Iraq War launched by his son wasn't, because it
correct.
didn't have Security Council authorization. And I remember how shocking that was. You're probably too young to have been shocked, but I had lived through the whole, well, I hadn't lived through the whole Cold War, I'm not quite that old, but enough of it so that I remember the UN as the Security Council as a somewhat frozen body by the Cold War,
Hmm.
because the US had a veto, Soviet Union had a veto, they were at loggerheads, so pretty much anything of significance was going to get vetoed by one or the other. There wasn't going to be like an invasion they both approved of.
Yeah,
And I still remember, like, when suddenly I saw the UN like on TV, like on the network news, it seemed like a new thing. It was like an active body, and George H.W. Bush, in that sense, helped kind of resurrect it. And you mentioned that he used it in a realist way. I think one thing he appreciated is that in many ways it was built as a realist institution. If you focus on the war and peace part, it was put together by the victors in World War II in a way that was designed to preserve their power.
yeah,
The permanent members of the Security Council have a veto. They're the ones who won the war.
yeah.
And he did use it that way. And my own
Yeah, I
view.
mean,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, I was just saying, like, yeah, like the geopolitical circumstances were important, right? This was right after the fall of the Soviet Union. The
Yeah.
United States was the single dominant unipower. It was like the
Hmm.
unipolar moment in world history. And on top of that, the actions of Saddam Hussein were such like an affront to most members of the United Nations. You had this bigger, stronger, more powerful country invading and occupying a smaller, less powerful
Yeah,
country, and
they'd
that kind of
invaded
struck
Kuwait. They wanted
Kuwait.
to
Yeah,
just take Kuwait, I guess,
yeah,
which
like
had a
take
lot of
their
oil.
oil. It was
Hmm.
yeah, and so that I think just kind of it was a combination of those two things. Like
Yeah.
Saddam's actions struck at the core of the UN Charter
Right.
and of the like treaty to which all the countries ascribed, and you had this great unipolar moment.
Hmm. In my own view, I'm curious. We'll get back to Trump, I promise, but I'm curious as to what you think of my view that if the U.S., let's imagine that it had been, we had had a series of presidents who are, by my definition, enlightened, and they had really set out to shore up respect for and compliance with international law, and had agreed with me that it actually is in the U.S.'s interest to respect the Security Council, even if sometimes they say, like, no, you can't invade Iraq, and shucks, we can't invade Iraq, and you comply with that. My view is that it would have been in America's interest, and I mean, related to that, I think we had the power, as you said, it was a unipolar moment. We had tremendous power to shape norms at that point, and I think we could have shaped a norm of complying with international law, at least at this most elemental level of not invading countries in ways that are illegal under international law. I think we could have really pulled it off in principle. Now, in practice, we have presidents, the White House changing hands all the time, and you've got domestic politics impinging on you. Um, but I think it's a thing that could have been done, and I think the world would be a better place, and I think there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine, for example. But I
Yeah.
don't know what you
And
think of
and
that.
I'm enough of an idealist still. I know that word makes your hair crawl, Bob, but I'm
No,
still
some of my best friends are idealists, and I am in a certain sense. But go ahead.
well, that it ain't too late, right?
Oh,
It's
okay,
tough.
that kind of idealist. You're crazy. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No,
Yeah,
I'm fighting
yeah.
the
It
fight. I'm
looks
fighting the
tough
fight.
now, but come on, why do what I do if
Hmm.
I don't believe that there is an affirmative place for international law, that it might be restored, that we might nudge the world towards a more peaceful and prosperous place that benefits all.
No, I think it may happen. I think it may take another crisis for it to happen. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the UN was born after World War II, and the League of Nations, an even less effective version of the same idea, was born after World War I.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately, it takes these kinds of traumas to get people to think about changing course in a fundamental way, and that's one thing that worries me. But no, I haven't given up. I mean, there's a reason I write a lot about international law, something that should be taken seriously. I think it's possible.
Yeah, no, for certain. And look, people, I do a lot of talks about the UN, and one point that I often try to emphasize, and which I'll say here too, is you look at the UN and people, rightly often point to how the UN failed to stop so and so, to stop, or to do something, to stop something terrible from happening. But you've brought up the UN in the context of World War II. In the 3 decades preceding World War II, there was nothing but great power conflict. And the United Nations, if nothing else, has, we've gone this longest stretch in modern history without a great power conflict. And I think that's partly due to the advent of the United Nations, that we have platforms to, for lack of a better word, talk about our problems, and mechanisms to talk about our problems, and rules to follow to avoid the escalation to great power conflict. Now, it's my view that we potentially may be on the precipice of great power conflict at the moment. Like, history is not aligning in our favor, but thus far, I think the UN has been a significant contributory factor to the fact that there has not been like a third world war.
And by the way, there was, since the Cold War, I mean, especially in the kind of immediate aftermath of it, the Security Council, you could argue, was pretty effective dealing with a fundamental issue of like authorizing or not authorizing military intervention. I mean, if you look at things that were authorized, okay, the Persian Gulf War and the Bosnia intervention, the U.S. interventions that were authorized, they like went okay in the sense that, we pushed the Iraqi troops back into Iraq. I think wisely the Bush administration decided not to try to go to Baghdad the way his son did. And then the Bosnia intervention, you could argue it came too late, but it saved some lives. And then it didn't, I don't think, left disarray in its wake. Now, compare that to not just the Iraq War, which we did without authorization, but the Kosovo intervention. That is still kind of a mess. And it's not resolved. We still have troops there. There's a flare up every once in a while. I mean, NATO troops at least, and I think American ones probably. And it drove the Russians nuts. And it led to certain problems with Georgia and so on down the road. So I think, the track record of the Security Council in those kind of 15, 20 years after the Cold War ended looks not that bad. I mean,
a couple of exceptions, like the Rwanda was a failure.
I mean, we didn't try to use it, right? Now, I will say there's a distinction between transborder aggression, which I would say is the main thing the UN was designed to prevent. Yes. And then these internal humanitarian disasters, which are internal to a nation, which is not so much what the UN was designed to deal with in the first place.
But it's what it's dealing with mostly now these days.
There's a certain amount of it, although we're also seeing a revival of, I would say, well, look, I mean, there's been a ton of transborder violence. But did Clinton try to use the UN for the Rwanda? He later said he regretted not trying to do more in Rwanda, but
I mean, essentially there was a small peacekeeping mission that was there that withdrew because peacekeepers weren't, like, at the time really mandated to protect civilians, and a bunch of Belgian peacekeepers got killed. And so the peacekeeping mission folded up and the Rwandan genocide accelerated. And in the UN sort of considers Rwanda and Bosnia twin failures. And in like the late 90s and early 2000s, they did this really like profound review of how peacekeeping kind of failed in those contexts and how it can be strengthened going forward. The Algerian diplomat, Lakhdar Brahimi, who's like one of these grand, wise diplomats, put out a report that's like kind of famous around the UN, the Brahimi report. And since then, peacekeeping has done a much more effective job of putting civilian protection at the center of its mandate, and also making sure that like the mandate that the Security Council gives peacekeeping missions, that is like, what are you there to do, aligns with the capacities and capabilities that the troops on the ground have to make these missions like much more effective. So you actually had, and I know you've mentioned like the Bush administration a few times, but it was during the Bush administration that you saw the second Bush administration, George W., that you saw the massive expansion of the use of UN peacekeeping to deal with smaller conflicts around the world. And by and large, those peacekeeping missions were really successful. In Liberia, for example, and actually in all of West Africa, Liberia is a good example of a peacekeeping mission that was deployed in the wake of a civil war that was absolutely as horrible as civil wars come. Had like tens of thousands of troops there, and basically worked itself out of a job. Did the kind of nation building, and did the kind of like rule of law building, and gave the warring parties space that they needed to develop political solutions to their former military problems. And today, you know, Liberia is still like a poor country, is a multi-party democracy without a peacekeeper in it. You saw the same thing in Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire. You have like a track record of success that UN peacekeeping has amassed over the years. And a lot of those missions, frankly, were ones that were started in the George W. Bush administration, believe it or not.
Now, at the moment, this thing is it Democratic Republic of Congo? Where there's been a rebel uprising that is supported by Rwanda, is that right?
Yeah, I'm going to do like an episode of Global Dispatches on this next week, in which I will interview like, you know, a regional expert. And one of the things I always do with Global Dispatches when I'm talking about like our region, get someone from the region to talk about it. So it's not filtered through like us Westerners. But yeah, essentially you had this Rwanda like denies, but everyone knows it's there. And there's like ample evidence that this is a Rwanda-backed rebel group called M23 that everyone thought had been defeated like 10 years ago, was dormant, but in reality, they were reconstituting themselves and now have sacked the largest city in Eastern DRC, Goma. And, you know, so we're talking about Rwanda, the Rwanda genocide earlier, but like one knock on of the Rwanda genocide was civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which brought in like, you know, almost all of the surrounding powers to, and it was the former genocidaires of Rwanda that, you know, fled to the DRC, started this like horribleness. And then you have the government of the DRC, which is weak, fight them back, but also use, you know, troops from surrounding countries. It was basically like Africa's World War that lasted for like many years, resulting in like millions of deaths. It was terrible, and it's sort of where the instability is derived from these days.
Okay, so let's talk about Trump and not so much the Security Council, but the many other things that are, you know, either. See, even I don't have a super clear idea of what the connections are of various international institutions to the UN in a formal sense. For example, there's this, I don't know what the status of the sanctioning of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is. You can maybe give us the latest on that, but is that a UN body? Is the ICC technically under the auspices of the UN or not?
No, it's a separate body. It has a relationship with the UN in one key way, in which one of the ways that the prosecutor of the ICC can have jurisdiction over crimes is by the Security Council affirmatively granting jurisdiction to the ICC. That's written into the Rome Statute, the treaty that gave birth to the International Criminal Court. That's been invoked twice. The first time, incidentally, was during the George W. Bush administration in the context of the genocide in Darfur, where the Security Council gave the prosecutor of the ICC jurisdiction to investigate crimes in Sudan. Now, Sudan was not a member of the ICC. If Sudan were a member of the ICC, the prosecutor wouldn't need to go through the Security Council. But since Sudan is not a member of the ICC, it required the Security Council to confer jurisdiction. The other was Libya as well. Libya, again, not a member of the ICC, but the Security Council gave the ICC jurisdiction to investigate alleged crimes against humanity there. But most of the cases that the ICC works on are ones in which the member state, the crimes are committed on the territory of a member state or by nationals of a member state. But in terms of like any formal linkages between the UN and the ICC, there is none. Like the ICC is not like a subsidiary body of the UN.
Okay, and then what about the International Court of Justice? And that predates the ICC, and that is, as I understand it, about actions taken. It's a place you can action can be taken against a state, whereas the ICC is a place where, for example, Bibi Netanyahu was indicted, right? Which is the reason there's for the sanctioning of the prosecutor.
I don't think the Republicans are going after the ICC for indicting Vladimir Putin for allegedly orchestrating like the mass kidnapping of Ukrainian children.
But he was he indicted? Putin was indicted by the ICC. Yeah, he was.
Yes, okay. Putin and like his governor, his like minister of children's affairs, were indicted by the ICC a year after the invasion, after it became clear the scale of like this mass kidnapping of Ukrainian children became apparent. But you're right. The ICC only investigates individuals. It's like a regular criminal court, and is not part of the United Nations. Whereas the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is a forum where states can take each other to court to settle disputes. Now, most of the time, these kinds of disputes are like fairly boring. Like they're about like who controls this. Does like Honduras or Belize control this like sandy atoll where there's like a protected turtle? So they're really like kind of low key disputes between countries that have friendly relations, but like want some like, but have maybe competing territorial ambitions, or maybe there's like some fishing rights issues going on. And that is that's like one of the core bodies of the United Nations.
Okay. And, the U.S. is not party to the ICC, but I guess almost by definition is to the ICJ because it is part of the UN. It would be great if we lived in a world where more serious border disputes were brought to the ICJ. And again, I can imagine that world. I mean, I can imagine that world having developed out of the Cold War if we had played our cards right. Because when you look at something like China and India, or for that matter, China and, Japan, China and the Philippines with these maritime border disputes.
Well, so it was. Like China's 9-line like maritime border disputes was brought before the International Court of Justice, which ruled decisively against China, but China just ignored it.
And when was that?
A few years ago-ish.
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, you can imagine a world where not only people bring things to the ICJ, but its rulings are actually respected, and countries even, in a certain sense, welcome. Some political leaders might welcome being relieved of the domestic political pressure that sometimes encourages them to be tough. I'm not saying that's what happened in the case of China. I think China believes it has really important strategic reasons not to get hemmed in that part of the ocean. But it would be, I can imagine this world.
Well, so this strikes to, I think, one similar feature between both the ICJ and the ICC, which is there's no like enforcement mechanism, right? There's no, like if China wants to ignore the ruling, no one's gonna no one can do anything about it. If like Honduras wants to ignore the ruling against like that little like key in dispute with Belize, they can. Now, similarly,
there's technically one thing they could do. It's the famous international peace and security passage in the UN Charter. Is that the term? I mean, the Security Council can authorize military force to push back against transborder aggression. That's clear.
Sure.
But there's also this phrase about maintaining international, what is it? International peace and security.
International peace and security. Yeah, like
That's
Chapter 7 of the UN Charter.
And in principle, I mean, the Security Council is like Supreme Court. It's like, what is the law? It's whatever it says it is, right? Yeah. It's like, if they say your failure to respect the ruling of the court on a border dispute threatens international peace, which actually you could argue it does. They could authorize military force. Now I'm speaking very, abstractly and conjecturally, but I just wanted to say there is a kind of power. But the other thing I'd say is, you're right. Ultimately, these things are, compliance with the law is a normative thing.
Yeah.
And that's even true within states. It's not out of fear of getting caught, that I comply with the law pretty consistently. I mean, in some cases maybe, but you have to cultivate the norm of complying with the law, and that's what I think.
And then, of course, when like a member of the Security Council or a key ally of a member of the Security Council is the one doing the violating of the law,
now that
then,
is
like China in the case of this ICJ ruling, or Russia in the case of Ukraine, or the United States and Israel in the case of Gaza, that's where you see its failings.
Yeah, that's where you have to have a meeting of the minds among the great powers. And that was the expectation. That was the hope after World War II. Didn't last long. But then the opportunity again was revived after the Cold War.
But so, I do. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You're in charge.
No. I was going to change the subject. So
let's change the subject. All right, here. I have one more point on the Security Council.
Okay.
Which people don't realize. I mean, you look at the Security Council today, and you see its failings on Ukraine. You see its failings on Gaza. And those are absolutely, failings of the Security Council doing what it was intended to do. But there are still a host of areas in which there is cooperation. The peacekeeping missions that I spoke of before, their mandates come out for renewal every year. And almost invariably, the great powers come together to decide, this is actually in all of our interests to maintain this peacekeeping mission. You had a new kind of structure of a mission in Haiti that was agreed to last October, which is not a peacekeeping mission, but is a Security Council authorized mission of Kenyan police to help the Haitian government stabilize the situation there. That was done unanimously at the Security Council, right? So there still are opportunities and moments in which the great powers still do come together on some of these issues.
Okay. So that is kind of a good segue to kind of getting back to Trump. I mean, I think most people, perhaps including me, have only a pretty foggy idea of what all the UN does, and therefore what would change if it just fell apart, right? Like, I mean, I take your point that we probably shouldn't expect Trump to try to systematically undermine it, and if he did, it would keep it going probably. In part because China would welcome the opportunity, which I assume China does with the WHO, maybe, to step in and provide more of the funding by virtue of the U.S. withdrawing, and therefore having even more of the kind of influence that we complain about in the WHO. So it would keep going. But if you kind of imagine that it didn't, what kinds of things would change? We could start with the WHO. Like what does the WHO do that's valuable, especially from an American perspective, but not only from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the WHO, it does like a lot of different things, which makes it hard to like explain in a pithy way. It supports, global vaccination programs against things like polio. It was why there's no smallpox in the world today. It eradicated that disease. I think it also is the platform in which health ministries and scientists and groups from around the world can cooperate and coordinate with each other on research as well, and set standards for, what medicines should be set for what diseases, what makes sense. It really is a lot of research. But to me, I think the most fundamental thing that the World Health Organization does is support the strengthening of health systems in poorer countries. So you have like the WHO, which itself has like a small footprint, but it works with national governments in, say, I don't know, I'm picking Liberia again, it's top of the mind. A country where like a lot of the health workforce was killed in the Ebola outbreak. And so it's like retraining, rebuilding that health force, establishing surveillance systems for diseases that might be emerged, but then doing things like helping the government of Liberia set up mobile payment platforms to pay their doctors and nurses, right? This maybe is not like immediately apparent to the United States of like why it would help me sitting in Denver. But let's be honest, like in today's world, a disease cannot be contained anywhere else. You want to have strong health systems in far-flung parts of the world so that diseases that might emerge there can be contained there before they become the next Ebola, before they become the next COVID. And like, look, right now, look at bird flu, right? It's the reason our eggs are really expensive here in the United States. You know, 2 weeks before Trump's inauguration, the first human in the United States died of bird flu, this guy in Louisiana who had like a backyard chicken flock. Well, the World Health Organization is the entity that does like the global monitoring and surveillance of instances and circumstances in which people are dying from bird flu. Furthermore, it's set up a platform for drug companies to create a vaccine that might be rapidly rolled out should human-to-human transmission of bird flu transpire. Meanwhile, you have this Trump order that not only defunds the World Health Organization, but prevents CDC from even talking to the World Health Organization at this point. They're not allowed to be on the same like Zoom call. It's nuts.
Yeah. No, I mean, contagious disease is a classic example of a transnational problem that transnational institutions can help you address. That some degree of international cooperation is you know where it makes sense from a point of view of strict national interest. And I think there's not enough appreciation of the fact that the primary argument for the UN from the beginning, and the primary argument for a lot of international institutional cooperation, is national self-interest. You're addressing non-zero-sum problems that you cannot adequately address alone.
But look, also, let's not just, I mean, like transmissible diseases are like the ones that are easiest to talk about. But a lot of what the World Health Organization does is non-communicable diseases, heart disease, kidney, like, failure, problems related to smoking. And in my view, like these are all very worthwhile things that the international community ought to come together around, like a degree of solidarity, right? Like we want people's health and livelihoods to improve in poorer countries because that like the global boat, gets lifted a little higher. That like benefits us down the road, more markets we could, export to, more potential customers, however you want. I mean, I look at it because I'm a hippy dippy kind of liberal. It's like good that people are living longer. That's like a good end in and of itself. But there are economic arguments as well to support like, why we should have like, common sense rules on, say, smoking, or understand and support smoking cessation efforts in poorer countries.
Yeah. No, I personally favor a lot of humanitarian stuff that is you justify just because it's good for human beings. But when I think of the Trump administration, I wish people, I think, Trump, well, I'm overgeneralizing, but some people in Trump's constituency sometimes talk as if, the only rationale for all kinds of international collaboration is woolly-minded humanitarianism as opposed to strict national interest. And more often than I think they appreciate national
and
interest.
also, it's like a tiny, tiny sum of money in the U.S. budgetary like framework. It's like $1.2 billion, which is like, what the Pentagon loses in like its couch and change, every month. It's really like a tiny outlay. And, the administration is framing this as some like cost saving exercise, but it's not.
Okay, so I want to keep talking about a lot of stuff, including what kind of UN ambassador Elise Stefanik is going to be. However, as you know, the point comes in these conversations where we go into overtime, and that is going to be accessible. It's always accessible to Nonzero members, paid subscribers to Nonzero newsletter. However, this conversation, you could also get access to by virtue of being one of your paid subscribers at Global Dispatches, right? We're going to make that the case, as I understand.
That is the case, and I got a lot to say about Elise Stefanik. You may be surprised.
Well, I wanted to leave them on the edge of their seats.
Yeah. But yes, you can go to globaldispatches.org and get a subscription, and you can listen to the rest.
Yeah. Now, when I think about Elise Stefanik, the very first phrase that comes to mind is paywall bait. You know, no, actually, I mean, I was almost entirely unaware of her until she started badgering university presidents about not cracking down on students who said from the river to the sea. So I'm interested in how you think she's going to perform as UN ambassador. But anyway, thanks to everybody who's followed us this far. We encourage you to join us for the rest of the conversation. But in any event, we thank you.